It's Mr. Boreen here. I've got the third and final video in our Networks of Exchange Land-Based Trade Routes series. If you have not watched videos number 1 and 2, I would highly recommend stopping this video, going back, watching number 1 and 2. I'm going to make some references to terminology and events and places that are covered in the first 2 videos. So if you have not watched those 2, it's highly recommended. The other big recommendation for this particular video today is going to be to hop into the unit number 2 study guide. I've got it pulled up here on the screen. You're going to scroll down below some of the key themes and vocabulary, and you'll see this reading and note-taking section. The Trans Saharan Trade and African Empires Outline is a really good resource that we've thrown together for you. I would recommend clicking into this thing, making your own copy, or printing it up and taking some notes along the way with this particular document. It'll give you a lot of background information, some key terminology, and specifically some information about the different kingdoms. And so for that reason, I'm not going to get deeply into the kingdoms because you have access to this document and you could add to it as you go. So just some basic quick recommendations for you guys to make things a little bit easier. I'm going to hop over into the slideshow and we're going to go ahead and get started with our final major trade network and route, and that's going to be Trans-Saharan Trade. So when last we left off, we were talking about the expansion of the Mongol system of trade, the Silk Road, and how the Mongols were a guarantor for trade because they were the major player in the game and everybody was really terrified of them. Now we're going to hop over into Africa to see a slightly different patterning of trade and exchange, but still one that's really reliant on political and economic factors as well as cultural ties to make the whole thing work. All right. So we're going to mainly be up here in Saharan Africa. We're going to be over here in West Africa, and we're going to take a look at some of the trade that takes place on the Niger River. But before we can even get to that, a little review and background information is always helpful. So please remember that in the Islamic world, the religion isn't founded until the 7th century, the 600 year in the Common Era. And so what that means is there's been people living in these African regions that are not Islamic people who have been beholden to a code of conduct and ethics that is outside of Islam. These people are the Bantu people, and they're an animistic, polytheistic people. Right? And the Bantu people living mainly in West Africa, in that same region where we're going to see a lot of this trade taking place, they diffuse out of this region over a period of, a couple hundred years. If you take a look at this map, they're going to migrate out mainly because they're looking for more resources. They're looking for more land and space. They're not highly connected to any one particular region. They're instead looking to move into Southern Africa to gather up more resources and have more space. And this Bantu people that diffuse and spread out their culture and their religion. And this is going to be important for us later, because Islam is going to be a unifying factor for Northern Africa, but in Southern Africa, Islam isn't going to have that same infusion and inroads that it has up in the north. And so what we're going to see is a different cultural set of values. It also then is going to serve to isolate some of the Bantu people. Finally, though, it does create a large cultural zone or region where people are united under one singular culture, in this case, the Bantu culture. Right? So when we talk about the Bantu people and the Bantu culture, what are we talking about? We're talking about mainly stateless societies, people who are connected more to smaller cultural groups and less to large-scale groups. Think about things fall apart and what we saw with the Ebu people in Chinua Achebe's story about the changing of culture from African culture to Western culture. These would be cultures that have been influenced by that Bantu migration, right? And so what we're going to see is a lot more clan-based culture, a lot more relationship to the environment, not necessarily to a specific place, but understanding the environment overall. All right, I highly recommend hopping in and taking a little bit deeper look by banging on this link when you're watching on your own, but that's not for this video. Okay, so hopping on, let's talk about that change over to Islam and what really drives this change to Islam. So So remembering back to unit number 1 and some of the stuff you guys got from Mrs. Dumas on the rise of Islam coming out of the Middle East, we know that Islam spreads really rapidly out of the Mecca-Medina basin in what is modern-day Saudi Arabia, moving north into Jerusalem, creating the caliphates, and then spreading like wildfire really across North Africa. And that's really going to be influenced by these Berbers. Now, the Berbers are traders, and they're people who are on the move. They're used to living in the desert environments, and they're people who are going to be pretty militant about their religion and their belief system. They convert under the banner of jihad, this idea of spreading religion and creating unifying culture. And we're talking about greater jihad, not lesser jihad, jihad for war, but greater jihad, the proselytization of Islam. And the Berbers are going to be really big pushers of religious conversion. And the reason that they're going to be these massive influencers, very similar to the Mongols in this case, is because they're only going to trade and interact with other Muslims. So as Berbers move from city to city to city throughout the course of their caravan movement across the Saharan desert, they're going to want to trade more and more with fellow Muslims because there's a cultural connection and a trust there. And if you want the Berbers to move things for you, and people during this time want the Berbers to be the primary movers because they're the people who best understand the desert, you then are going to need to be a Muslim, right? And so the Muslims are going to sort of monopolize trade movement. What's being traded is also of great importance to us as well, because a lot of the goods that are coming out of northern Africa are the types of goods that, just like on the Silk Road, are goods that are regionally specific. And the most important of these, arguably, is salt. This predates periods of time where you have the ability to refrigerate food. And so if you're moving on a great distance or you want to make sure that you have a food base, you could use salt to cure meat. You could use salt to dry out any sort of product that you're trying to move. Think about maybe dehydrating fruit for long journeys as well. And so salt becomes a really valuable resource. Similarly, precious metals, and we'll talk a lot more about gold here in a second, and various crops. And you guys know about the significance of and importance of yams down there at the bottom. These are all regionally specific foods as well. And so what we start to see here is that if you want to move your goods that people can't get anywhere else, so therefore they're valuable, they're precious goods, you're going to need a reliable mover, and those movers are the Berbers, right? So we've hit on the Berbers. We've talked about the importance of Islam. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the key technologies, and then specifically about the role of gold in driving trans-Saharan trade. So one of the things that's really important to understanding the success of the Trans-Saharan Trade Network is to understand the invention of the camel saddle. Now, the camel saddle sounds like something that's really not that important. It's not that big of a deal, but it is, because it allows a rider to move across the desert much more efficiently. They could ride on the camel instead of walking on the camel, thus picking up the speed a little bit of movement. And that's really important when you're out in the desert, right? The other thing that's important is it allows for a little bit more growth in the size of caravans. You could have more people in the caravan, and you could carry the most precious resource of all, which was gold. Now, gold is really important because the gold was in really high demand, specifically in Europe and in the Islamic world. And we're going to talk about Europe here for a second, because a lot of Europe's rebirth and growth is going to be basically funded by the Trans-Saharan Trade Network and the gold that's coming out of the Niger River Basin. Now, on the Silk Road, you had something that's called a banking house, and that's one of our key terms. A banking house is kind of like a customs house where you could come in, you could deposit your money as a merchant, you could get a bill that you could use to go out and buy things in the market. The bill said that you were good for that money, and then somebody could go to the banking house, collect that money, right? It's like a proto bank. It's not an actual bank. In Europe, banking houses don't exist. So what you need to have is hard currency. You need something to back up your sales, and you have to be able to have that exchange take place in real time. This predates the creation of the banking industry that'll take place in the Renaissance. And so European monarchs need to have access to some sort of hard currency, and that hard currency is going to be the gold that's coming out of North Africa. So in North Africa, you've got the salt, but you've also got the gold, and these are going to become really highly prized resources for two different reasons. The salt becomes really important later on when the Indian Ocean Trade Network gets looped in and creating this full network of exchange that's completely closed off, because that salt will be really valuable for sea journeys. The gold is really, really important in Europe because it gives you hard currency. So banking houses don't exist yet inside of Europe. So you need hard currency. Where does that hard currency come from? It comes from the Trans Saharan Trade Network. Now, because you have all of this trade taking place, you're going to see the construction of these major empires. And these are those empires that I recommend you take a look at on that outline that we posted for you. Now, each one of the different empires that you see here, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, are all basically overlapping in terms of geographic region that is under their control, but not in terms of the period of time. You can think about these as successive empires, and each one getting a little bit larger and more powerful over time. And that's in large part due to the expansion of trade. Now, as these empires grow, one of the things that we see is that the wealth is reinvested back into the community, and that we see, just like we saw in the Baghdad House of Wisdom, more wealth, more access to resources, and more access to trade usually means a cultural renaissance. And so what we see growing out of the desert are these new non-Bantu civilizations that are really linked to Islam in a lot of ways, but still have a root or foundation found in traditional Bantu culture, right? And so what we see, one of the things that we see that's really pretty cool is the creation of new syncretic forms of culture like architecture. And then on this page here, we've got an image of the Great Mosque at Djenné, which is in Timbuktu in the Mali Empire or Malay Empire. And what we see are some of the traditional Bantu elements. You see the logs, the foundational logs coming up, but then you see very clearly the minarets and the spires here along the edges that would hark back to a traditional mosque, right? So it's pretty cool to see as the trade expands, as Berber influence starts to push Islam deeper and deeper and deeper into Western Africa. We see the development of a new syncretic culture. For more on syncretic cultures, make sure you go back and look into video number 1, where I discuss that in a little bit more depth. Now, these trade routes are really, really important as well because they diffuse many different groups of people. And some of these important people are going to be men like Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta is important to us not because he's like this like heroic mythic figure, but because he's a great chronicler. So Ibn Battuta traveled many of the trade networks during this time period, and he lays down to us a really accurate, well-developed historical record that shows his travel throughout the course of many of these networks of exchange. And he talks about the different people and the different customs that he is exposed to over time. The other person who's really, really important and famous, is specifically in the Trans Saharan Trade Route, is this man named Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a king. He goes on his traditional Hajj, right? So he's going to leave out of Timbuktu. He's going to travel north and across North Africa as he makes his way to Mecca to complete one of the pillars of Islam. And as he does this, he's basically going out on a advertising trade mission. And he's going to hand out lots of money, right? He's going to do the zakat. He's going to give to the poor, again, because these are the pillars of Islam. And as he does this, he's actually going to spread and diffuse a lot of wealth. It's rumored that the amount of money and gold that he gives away actually creates runaway inflation, and the price and value of gold drops during this time period, which really hurts European recovery and trade in the Mediterranean, because again, they need all that gold. They want that currency. Gold's not worth as much, so they've got a problem, right? All this to say that the Trans Saharan Trade Network definitely, even though it seems like a little bit of a backwater, had a lot of influence on trade during this time period. All right. So to wrap things up for us here, guys, in terms of networks of trade and exchange that are land-based, you need really strong empires. You need really strong systems for economics, whether they're banking houses like we talked about today, or some sort of guarantor, or taxation. And then you're going to need to have some sort of unifying culture to bring everybody together and build a lot of trust. All right. So make sure you go back in. You guys definitely are going to have a DBQ on this one. Use the study guides, and we'll catch you on our next one. Bye.